Welcome to the Rational Egoist. I'm your host, Michael Liebowitz. Well, I've already done a few shows on offender reform and criminal rehabilitation, and I plan to keep doing them as often as I can get guests on to talk about the subject. And we're lucky enough today to have somebody well equipped to talk about it. She's a professor of psychology at John Jay College in New York. She's published over 100 peer-reviewed articles and book chapters and has co-authored 3 books, including New Frontiers in Offender Treatment, The Translation of Evidence-Based Practices to Correctional Settings. Dr. Elizabeth Jeglic, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
To begin with, what is cognitive behavioral therapy? Because that is a very effective treatment of both non-offenders and offenders alike. So what are the basics?
So CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, is an evidence-based practice where we kind of understand that people's thoughts impact their behaviors, and then those behaviors get reinforced or punished, and then it increases them. So I like to use the example, like if you're walking down a street and somebody looks you up and down, that's an event, right? And the way that you process that event, those are your thoughts. So you can either think that person thinks that I look fabulous, and so you're now going to walk with your head held high. You're going to interact with the world in a more positive way, and people are going to respond to you differently, and so that your behaviors will be, reinforced, and that you'll end up probably having a better day. If you interpret the same event, like somebody looks you up and down while you're walking down the street, as, oh, they must hate my outfit, they think I look really bad today, then you're going to internalize like, oh, I don't look good, I'm going to feel more negative. You're going to kind of put out that more negative energy. People are going to probably stay away from you. You're going to isolate, and therefore your day is going to end up being worse than it would have been had you interpreted it in a positive way. So it's really the way that we interpret events. And so, like, for example, the same thing can be said, like if somebody bumps into you in a bar, if you think, oh, that person did it on purpose, your thoughts are going to be more, the thought is somebody did it on purpose, then you're going to feel angry, hostile. Those are your emotions. And you might, push them back. You might be, aggressive, things like that. Versus if you kind of think, oh, that was an accident, then you just can kind of go on with your evening and nothing happens. So it's really the way that you interpret events. So it's your thinking then impacts your emotions and your behavior.
And what are some common thought distortions that impact our interpretations of events, like the one you just named, where somebody bumps into me and I automatically ascribe intent to that person? Like, so
Sure,
what explains
yeah.
that? What are the thought distortions?
I mean, there's people who look at the world through kind of like, negative goggles, I guess. We all know those pessimistic people, right? Like, so everything, so, you have black or white thinking, like everything is responsible, that everything is everybody else's fault, like you have an external locus of control that I have no control. A lot of what we see, is that people have negative views of themselves, others, and the world around them, and that kind of influences the way that they work through the world. It's very clear with like depression, for example. You kind of have a negative view that, I'm kind of a failure, everything is going to turn out bad. And if you have those perceptions, when kind of those neutral events happen, you interpret them in a negative light. Others have more hostile interpretations of the world, and it could be like, if they've been experienced a lot of unfairness in their lives, they kind of view like, situations that maybe others would view differently in a hostile world, like that they're out to get me, that this is something that is negative that is happening, and they respond more aggressively. And people who have kind of a more anxious predisposition might have kind of a worried interpretation, like, oh, something bad is going to happen, and so they're always looking for that kind of worry. So there's different ways that you kind of interpret, neutral situations.
I remember when I was studying Aaron Beck and I came across the idea of magnification. And
Hmm.
I did for a couple months thought reports to
Yeah.
track my thinking. And I noticed that over and over again, I blew things out of proportion. And the way I knew I did that is because in all the events that I was so concerned about and stressed out about over a course of months, looking back at them, none of them amounted to anything.
Yeah.
And looking back, I'm just like, why did I even concern myself with this? But
And that's
even,
beautiful because you saw that thought pattern, right? Like that's exactly what we
yes,
want you to do, is kind of to track that and recognize those thinking errors that you have.
it's interesting to me though, because even though I know I do that, I'm still prone to doing it. in the moment, it's much more difficult to say, yes, I'm blowing this particular event, out of proportion than it is when looking back. Now, being aware of it has allowed me to get much better,
Correct.
but my initial response to events is to blow them all out of proportion.
Yeah. And that kind of ties into our core beliefs, which kind of develop as like when we're children. So it might have been that that was just, you had some thoughts that developed when you were a kid based on your childhood experiences, and that's your way of interacting with the world. But the fact that you have recognized that pattern is really helpful, because I'm sure that once that pattern has been recognized, that is not blown out to the same degree as it was before, right? It might not be impacting your life as much. The other thing that we have kind of seen continuously with research is that people have these dysfunctional thoughts or this distorted thinking process when they're feeling more vulnerable. So when you are hungry, when you are tired, when you are kind of more emotionally, over aroused, that's when, our thinking starts to kind of revert to those more, negative and ways of processing information. And so that's why it's really important. Like if you think about, like self-care and psychotherapy in general is really trying to take care of yourself. So getting those 8 hours of sleep, eating healthfully, exercising, because if you do all that, then you are just better equipped to handle it when situations happen, and you're less likely to kind of go to those like extremes like that magnification, minimization, all or nothing thinking, black or white thinking, that kind of thing.
So when dealing with offenders, especially in a correctional setting,
Yes.
what are some distortions that the offenders are more prone to than your average person would be prone to?
And a lot of this also varies obviously by the individual. And we also see different types of, distortions based on the type of offense that is, those who perpetrate sex crimes might have different distortions than those who perpetrate violent crimes. In general, obviously there is injustice in the criminal justice system. And so there's a lot of, the world is out to get me. This is unfair. The kind of the negative, hostile view of the world we often see. People who are justice involved disproportionately have trauma histories. And so they have had, a lot of things that have happened to them that are unfair. And so this kind of gets internalized. And so you see that, there's a negative outlook towards the world generally, and a more hostile way of kind of approaching the world.
And what about the criminogenic needs? Like, it's been a while, so if I get any of them wrong, forgive me. But antisocial values and beliefs, an attraction to antisocial peers, like you said, the victim thinking. Are these, how do I put it? Are these more universal or more extreme amongst the criminal population than they would be amongst your average person seeking psychotherapy?
Sure. I mean, the reason that they are justice involved is because they've often sought to fulfill their wants and needs through criminal means, right? Like, so for example, for somebody who perpetrates sex crimes might have a need for connection, but they do it with an inappropriate, you know, person, right? Like they do it with a child or somebody who is non-consenting. Somebody who wants to, have the need of pleasure met might do it through, drinking or drugs, that kind of thing. And so they're engaging in behaviors that, through their learning history, have kind of met those needs that we all have, but they've done it because of like the way that they either the situations that have happened to them, their trauma history, whatever, through criminogenic ways.
Growing up and when I was involved in my own criminal behavior and also through my 25 years of incarceration in analyzing myself and others, one common element that I frequently found, and it manifested itself in a nimity of ways, is that offenders tend to be totally indifferent to how their behavior affects other people. In other words, I want this right now, and it's not even a matter of saying I don't care how it affects others. It's a matter of that doesn't even enter into the calculus. I mean, something as simple as having a loud argument outside of somebody's door, or slamming dominoes, or stealing something, whatever it may be. There's this indifference. Have you noticed the same thing in your interaction with offenders and in your research?
And I think what you're speaking to a lot is a manifestation of trauma. So, like when kids at a young age have been exposed to trauma, that changes the brain chemistry. And also, a lot of kids, who end up just as involved have been exposed in utero to substances and to other kind of stressors. And so, some of that is just like brain differences, right? That the frontal lobes don't have as much development. And so there's that impulsive behavior, right? So that you act before you think, and that's really hard. We also see with people, who have been exposed in utero that they have more of those psychopathic tendencies, right? That lack of empathy and the thinking about how others interpret situations. And so it could just be that that's the way they have, that there are brain differences that have resulted from either in utero exposure to stressors or substances, or their trauma history, which has impacted their brain development, which has caused that kind of, impulsivity and need for immediate gratification, such that they don't consider the needs of other people. And it's just, we often also see like antisocial traits and psychopathic traits where you have less of the empathy for other people. And that's going to lead you to engaging in behaviors that, might be more impulsive and get you into trouble with the law.
So within the framework that you just provided, what is your view on personal responsibility? I'm huge on personal responsibility.
Sure.
I had a very rough upbringing, but I'm also aware of others who had similar upbringings who didn't make the choices that I made, who made better choices and became successful people. And I'm also aware of my own change that once I owned it, I was able to transform myself into a responsible human being. And I know others who have done the same. So
Yep.
even given all that,
Yep.
aren't the criminals still, when the rubber meets the road, responsible for their own behavior?
Sure. Nobody can change your behavior but you, right?
Uh,
I mean, I think we can have empathy. I think we can understand that some people have a more difficult path due to a variety of reasons. It's just like, a child who has learning disabilities can still learn, but
yeah.
their path might be different, right? They're going to
Yes.
struggle a little more and they need more help. Similarly, somebody who either, has had a rough childhood, who's experienced trauma, it's going to be harder for them because they have not had, parents who have shown them the right way. They have had violence perpetrated against them. They have not had mentors, perhaps, or all the financial opportunities that somebody else might have. And so it's going to be a different road for them, and it might be more challenging, but we can still give people the skills and the abilities to make those choices and help them along the way. And so I agree. Ultimately, if you want to make change, it's on you, right? Like you can we can recognize that your background has made it more difficult for you to make those right choices, but you can then make those choices and seek out the skills to go forward and make a different life for yourself.
For my own conceptual clarity, the way that I've often described what I think you're talking about is that there's a reason for a person's behavior, but a reason isn't the same as an excuse. Like I can
Correct.
point out and say, okay, you had a tougher time, you had a difficult path. That doesn't then justify your hurting other people, for
Correct.
instance.
It doesn't justify, no. It makes it like we can understand why it
Right.
happened, right? But you still made that choice.
Yes.
And so you can change. And so we have to ultimately, if you want to change, you have to accept culpability for what you have done and recognize that it has been more challenging for you, but that you can make a difference and go forward and have a different life.
Okay, so if you are counseling offenders, if you've got them in front of you and you know the thought distortions that are pretty much universal, you know thought distortions that are more concentrated in offender populations, and you also know the individual's history. How would you use cognitive behavioral therapy to help alter the offender's thinking so that they can become the more productive individuals and more responsible individuals?
So, a lot of it is kind of recognizing that history, right? And kind of showing them this is where you came from. These are the things that happen. These are the thoughts that you've developed, and this is where you are right now. And then explaining the cognitive model, how thoughts influence emotions and behaviors, and really get them to make those connections. And this can take time, as you kind of talked about yourself. Like it took you a while to track and recognize that pattern for yourself. There have also been two kind of conceptual models that are being applied in the correctional population. The first is the risk needs responsivity model. The second is the good lives model. And the good lives model really postulates that everybody wants to have a good life, and that's kind of comprised of different domains like, you know, having, you know, family and friends, having work, having excellence and like having hobbies, having spirituality. And so what we do is we kind of see where the individual wants to go. And so, like, what is an ideal life for you? You know, and what is, if you imagine yourself having a good life, what does that look like for you? And where are you now? And then, you know, you kind of see where that gap lies. And so you can say, I want to have a job. I want to have, you know, friends and family, and you don't have those things right now. So then with cognitive behavioral therapy, we'll identify goals and we'll work to achieving those goals using a variety of different cognitive and behavioral strategies. So for example, if you want to have connection with other people, and that's really important to kind of you kind of making, you know, a life without crime, but you have difficulty socializing. So we'd identify that as a problem. We would explore, you know, okay, what happens when you're in a social situation? And it might be like you have these thoughts like people are going to reject me, so therefore I reject them first. And so, you know, we will start to recognize that pattern and we'll observe in different situations how those thoughts manifest. And then we'll try to find evidence against that. You know, like, so you went to the commissary and you sat down. Did everybody move away from you? No. Did they reject you? No. So does everybody rejecting you? So is it possible that some of your thoughts that everybody is going to reject me are not true? And so you kind of start chipping away at those things. You'll simultaneously also engage in behavioral strategies. So if you want to have connection with others, what are some of the things that, you know, you want to do, that what are people do to have connection with others? So it might be that you want to rekindle that connection with your mom, and so you start calling your mom more often. So you develop a behavioral strategy. So how often are you going to call your mom? What are some things you can say to her to kind of foster that connection, while simultaneously also thinking about the thought processes along the way, and intervening when that happens, if that makes sense.
It does. A large part of, I don't know, a large part, a part of my offending was rooted in my abandonment fears. My abandonment fears were strongly rooted in my mother overdosing when I was a kid, being left alone, that sort of thing. And my father, he was, you know, in and out of my life. And while I was working through this and using the, you know, the cognitive model, every night before bed, I would go through these things. And I would say, okay, the way that my parents treated me is a reflection on them, not on me. It doesn't
Correct.
mean I'm unlovable or I'm unlikable. This was their problem. I also went through the idea that not everybody in the world is my parents. Not everybody is going to act like that.
Absolutely. Yes.
And I also would train myself to believe everybody is not going to leave me. Everybody's not going to abandon me. And then, which is probably the most important, is that even if people do leave me, one, it's not a reflection necessarily on me. And two, I can take it.
Yes.
So by training myself through all these things, now, while I was dealing with this, processing this, my mother committed suicide while I was
Sorry.
incarcerated. And so I said to myself, well, what can I take from this? What can I learn? And what I learned was that everything that I had been training myself and telling myself was accurate. As painful as it was, I survived it. I was
Yeah.
okay. I was able to move forward with my life. It didn't completely debilitate me. And I thought, well, if I can take this loss, this abandonment, which is the ultimate act of abandonment, then certainly I can deal with a girlfriend breaking up with me or somebody rejecting me or rejecting my friendship.
Wow. That's, you know, really a higher level of being able to integrate that. So you developed coping skills, right? Like, so that you were able to handle that. Like, everybody is going to feel loss with such a significant loss in their life, but you did go on. So that's resilience. You developed coping skills to recognize that you are resilient. And then similarly, you had behavioral experiments where you tried, you know, different relationships, and not everybody left you. And so, you know, as you recognize that, while you had these formative, you know, abandonments in your youth, they weren't reflective of you necessarily, and that and trying new relationships, recognizing that not everybody is going to abandon you. And so that kind of influences that core belief that everybody is going to abandon me and provides evidence to the contrary. So you are doing behavior experiments to test that. And then therefore you are able to change that core belief that, everybody is going to leave me. It is somehow my fault.
So when you're in a correctional setting, in dealing with a difficult population, I remember reading in the Cognitive Behavioural Therapy for antisocial personality disorder, or for personality disorders in
Mhm.
general. And they talked about how difficult it is in dealing with folks with antisocial personality disorder, which is in large part a fancy way of saying criminal. I mean, I get that not everybody in prison has it, but the estimates go
Mhm.
up to like 75% of
Yeah,
serious offenders, right? And they said this is a population that doesn't want to change in general, which makes it very difficult. But there's other challenges as well. So when you're trying to implement this in a correctional setting, what are some of the challenges that you face?
sure. So antisocial personality disorder and psychopathy are often kind of, interchanged simultaneously.
Yeah,
But antisocial personality disorder, despite having personality disorder in its name, often just refers to engaging in criminal behavior. So if you look at
right.
a lot of the characteristics, it just means that you're engaging in a lot of delinquent
Yeah.
behaviors. It doesn't
Mhm.
mean that you have a personality that is delinquent versus
Yeah.
psychopathy, which is more like that, you don't have a lot of caring for other people. And that really is, and there's evidence now that that's more of a brain disorder, right? Somebody has been born without that ability to kind of care about their actions and care about how they impact others. But what I do is kind of look at the person's life, like, do you like your life right now? Right, is this something that you want to, like, do you want to be in jail? Do you want to be having this life where you're kind of constantly in trouble with the law, you don't have this stability? And often the answer is no. And so again, going back to that good lives model, what is it that you want in life? Like, what is it like? And oftentimes, like, it's tangible things like wealth and an apartment and a girlfriend and whatever else. And hopefully as people grow and mature, there'll be other elements to what a good life means. But you kind of say, like, okay, so you're right now in prison, are you able to get that? And they're like, no. So is this something that you want? And they're like, yes. And so how can we do that using non-criminal means, right? So that you're not constantly in this like ever revolving cycle of in and out of prison, in and out of trouble. And so you work with them to kind of get those goals that they have. So they want material goods, for example, but they're doing it through selling drugs and stealing. So that's not worked for them because ultimately they don't get stuff that way. So what might be other ways of doing that? And so you brainstorm, you problem solve, and then you develop strategies. So that might be like they're going to have to work. And so, okay, so what are some skills? So they might need to learn something. They might need to go back to school to get their GED. They might need to develop a skill. Like, so if they're incarcerated, there's various things that you can learn that might be helpful, auto body shop, for example, so that they can earn money to get those kinds of things in a way that's not going to keep them incarcerated. So it's kind of looking again, where do you want to be? Where are you? And what are the skills that we can teach you? And what are some of those cognitions that are impacting you along the way? But we've seen with people who have psychopathy, historically, people have thought these people are untreatable. But really it's because we're trying to change them. So if, psychopathy is more of a personality disorder and we can't change them, but we can change their behavior and their means of going about what their goals are. So maybe they've wanted to have those material things and they've been using criminogenic means. So we can work with them to do that in a way that is not criminal. And so how can they achieve those goals without hurting other people or without, breaking the law? Because they don't like being in jail either.
No, no, not many people do. I really want to talk too about the institutional obstacles. If, for instance, in a social cognitive model of behavior, watching how other people behave is very important, and also the rewards and punishments that one gets for behaving in specific ways is very important. So, in a
Yes.
correctional setting, the correctional officers often behave very irresponsibly. So, what offenders do is they look at that and say, look, everybody's just like me. The only difference is I've been caught. Then you add to that that good behavior in prison is often punished, whereas bad behavior in prison is often rewarded. The classes that you talked about, like an automotive class or wood shop or upholstery classes, they're often taught by people who don't know what they're doing and don't have a real interest in doing it. They're just there for a check. So like if you look at the mission statement for the Connecticut Department of Correction, it's very high, high minded. It's evidence-based practices, directed toward helping offenders acclimate back into society and that sort of thing. But it's just fiction. It sounds good, but it isn't real. And even when you have a good program, sometimes they're not implemented properly. Like they had
Correct.
a program called Good Decisions, Good Intentions, Bad Decisions. And it was based on the work of somebody that I have a lot of respect for that really helped me change my life, Dr. Stanton Samanow. But the program wasn't implemented properly.
Correct. Yes.
It's therapeutic integrity is what it's called when a program isn't
Yes.
implemented properly. That has to be a huge obstacle when you're trying to counsel offenders, because when I
Yes.
developed a program, a friend of mine and I, one of the things we constantly came up against was the guys saying, well, look how everybody else behaves. Look how the staff behaves. Look how the counselors behave. And when you have to fight against that, it's just an additional obstacle.
Absolutely.
Has that been your experience as well?
Largely, yes. I mean, I think, we talk about criminal justice reform, right? And I think, we recognize that our treatments can work if implemented correctly. And in the Commonwealth countries, in the UK, Canada, Australia, there's a lot more emphasis on kind of rehabilitation than on punishment. The US is still premised on the punishment model. And the other issue with the US, unlike some of the other countries where a lot of this research comes from, is that every state reinvents the wheel, right? There's no centralized prison system, there's no centralized programming. So it's like we can't have data, and so these programs are being implemented differently in different places. And then the other issue is that we don't value this type of work. So we're not paying people decent salaries. And so there's a high turnover. The environments are not, conducive to rehabilitation, as you pointed out. Like I remember when I got in, I'm from Canada originally, when I came to the US and I came into a prison and they still had skeleton keys. I'm like, you have skeleton keys? Like I couldn't understand, like, this is like, the 2000s and we have skeleton keys to open and close doors. Like that just didn't make sense to me. Or that, that they're even like individuals' records were not computerized. They're paper things that travel with them from facility to facility. Like, how are you going to get any data on somebody if you're like lugging around these files that are like, like 2 feet tall? And how are you going to do research on that and assess, outcomes and stuff like that? So I think a lot of it is really investing in rehabilitation, and we have not done that. And we have to, as a society, say that if we want to make change, I mean, there are so many different points that we have to change the system. But part of that is like some people would need to be incarcerated, right? Not the numbers that we have today, but some people do.
Sure.
But if we see this instead of a punishment as an opportunity to better oneself, and we get people in those milieus who believe in that goal and who are living that and modeling that for the people, then we're going to see that. But as you said, like if you have people that are turning over every 6 months, that, they're underpaid, overworked, like you'll see, like, in corrections, people have double, triple shifts, right? Like they're worn out. They're not going to be their best selves either. They're going to, recognize that they just are going to give the minimum because they're not being reinforced either. Like everybody is a human being, and we do better when we have like, you're doing a great job and you get paid for doing a great job and that's rewarded. And it's just not in our system. And so until we make that shift and we recognize that part of rehabilitation is investing in it and investing in the people to provide quality therapy, because therapy does work, as you've pointed out, the evidence suggests as such, like when programs are done that kind of address risk, needs, and responsivity and use cognitive behavioral therapy and are well implemented, they do reduce recidivism. But if it's just like, somebody who doesn't care, who is just there, like, to get their paycheck and who's not doing the work, you're not going to make a difference. So it's really having that shift. And that's not something that's going to happen overnight, but it really involves kind of societal change and valuing this, and part of criminal justice reform, I think.
In the 70s, Robert Martinson, of course, had a
Yeah.
report that's much cited about how
Yes.
nothing works. Now, that has been repudiated over and over again. His methodology, even he had a partial mea culpa. But there has since then been a massive amount of studies, meta analysis after meta analysis, that have shown that there are approaches that work. So
Correct.
you mentioned the risk need responsivity model and the good lives model, both of which are cognitive behavioral models.
Yes.
How do these treatments compare with others when it comes to the evidence of actually reducing criminal offending?
So part of the risk needs responsivity model is in the responsivity principle. They suggest using cognitive behavioral therapy, and the Good Lives model suggests that, in order to achieve those needs that people have for a good quality of life, you're going to need to teach people skills using cognitive behavioral means. And all the data, and even the National Institute of Justice basically says the best practice in treatment of justice involved individuals is using cognitive behavioral therapy. And so it really is the treatment of choice, and the evidence is kind of overwhelming that it can work if it implemented correctly. I think they did some more recent meta-analyses where they looked at the quality of the treatment, and really it's the quality that matters, not just
Sure.
that you're saying you're doing cognitive behavioral therapy, but that you're really doing it in the way that it's supposed to be done, and kind of measuring those outcomes. So the data on the GLM is still not out there, but I think, knowing what we do about how people function, and how if you're given kind of pro-social goals versus punishment goals, like, then we're more likely to engage in pro-social behavior. So it's kind of been recommended, and it's being implemented, at least in the Commonwealth countries. It's part of the treatments now, and kind of in various parts of the US, I've seen people implementing GLM as well in various capacities.
Now, in absence of cognitive behavioral therapy, how do the standard practices in prisons work? I mean, like they have the AA, NA,
Yeah,
your voc ed programs or your educational programs where guys can get their degrees.
sure.
In my view, if you do that stuff, but you don't address the underlying thinking through cognitive behavioral therapy of the offenders, you're just wasting your time. I've seen zero evidence that shows that these things are very effective. There was a study done by the Rand Corporation. I read about this when I was incarcerated, that they said that education, significantly reduces recidivism, and they put a number. I don't remember exactly what it was, but as I read the study, and through self-selection problems and the people that were eliminated from taking these classes, it occurred to me that this is not a very robust study. And then come to find out, when I read the psychology of criminal conduct, when they selected out the studies that were included in that meta-analysis by Rand, the studies that were actually, high quality, the reductions in recidivism were much lower than
Hmm.
that touted by the education crowd. So
Sure.
how do those? In other words, am I right when I say that those other things, absent cognitive behavioral therapy, are not going to have the desired effect?
I think they have to work in together, right? Like, if you don't have, I think you have to change yourself, right? Because something brought you in prison. There was some decision that was made that was not good, that led you to engage in criminal behavior. But at the same time, we don't, from the desistance literature, which is part of criminology, that education and employment do lead to desistance. So I think you have to target the thought processes. You have to address some of those underlying issues, the trauma or whatever else that brought you to the criminal justice system. But in addition, you also have to give people skills, right? So that they have something like that's employable, and education to help them kind of achieve those goals when they get out. I think, as you said, in absence of, I think all of that has to be done together. And that's what the real rehabilitative approach is. I mean, some people might come in and they might have an education, so they don't need to go for additional education. So that's maybe not an issue for them. But the average individual who's incarcerated doesn't have, a high school degree or a college degree. So that can be beneficial while also working on themselves. If you don't have employment skills, teaching somebody employment skills when they're released is going to be very helpful to help, meet some of their basic needs. So, I think it all functions together. And if you think about that good life, part of it is lack of emotional turmoil, or having a good quality of life. And that's the psychological piece. But you also have to have that stability, like the housing, the food, the things like that. And that's where kind of employment and education can kind of help to provide you with that stability. So it all works together. They're not separate.
As somebody who works in this space yourself, I mean, you have on the right people that say lock them up and throw away the key. That's a bit of hyperbole, but the
Yeah.
basic is the purpose of the correctional system is to punish, just get them in there. We're not here to rehabilitate them. Then you have some on the left who say, no, the purpose is not to punish, the purpose is to rehabilitate. These people are, in essence, victims. And then if you go even further left, you have people who say that rehabilitation shouldn't be the goal, because who the hell are you to tell people how they, should and shouldn't think? You're trying to acculturate them into, your Western worldview, whatever. Add to that all the obstacles that we've talked about. How frustrating is it to work in this area where there's so many uh, different obstacles in every direction?
Yes, it is very frustrating. I actually wrote like a book on criminal justice reform, and like pretty much at every step along the way, there are obstacles that need to be reformed. I like that people are talking about this, right? Criminal justice reform is a buzzword, so that's good. And it's actually a nonpartisan issue that like both the left and the right seem to agree that we have to do something, since we have the highest incarceration rate in the world. Um, so we have to do something about this, but as you said, it's not easy, and this is not something that we can just do a little tweak here or there. We really have to change from the ground up, and I don't know that we are invested in doing that. And until like we can do that, it's going to be really hard to make those changes. But we do, I think rehabilitation should be the goal. Like if people make we have a legal system, right? And so we generally agree on the laws, like we shouldn't be doing these things and we should be doing those things. And when people violate those, there need to be consequences. But we should use that time to help people learn those skills and overcome any, what led them to break those laws, to engage in those rule violations, and help them so that in the future they will not do that. Because that's not only good for them, it's good for all of us, because incarceration is so expensive. Like think about, how much it costs. Like we're giving somebody like free food and lodging, and we're paying for that. We're paying for people to look after them. We are paying for the police to go after and arrest them. And so it behooves all of us in order to prevent recidivism, right? Like not only are we helping that individual and their family to have a better life, but we have to then pay less to engage in all that, incarceration and police involvement, court involvement, things like that. So it just makes sense as a society to have less of all of that, and we can do that
Sure
through
does.
rehabilitation.
I like your cat. My cat woke me up at 3 o'clock this morning, which was a reminder that cats have their own agenda,
Yes,
independent of whatever we want to do.
yes.
Okay, is there anything that I didn't ask or that we didn't get to talk about that you think is highly relevant to the discussion that needs to be said?
I mean, really just valuing rehabilitation, I think, and even Martinson, I think, his conclusions were misinterpreted, and he also ultimately went to die by suicide. I think in part because he felt like, that his work was misinterpreted and kind of um, led people to kind of believe in these laws like three strikes and you're out, and which has led to our mass incarceration problem. So I really think that if we want to make a difference as a society and we want to move in a positive direction, we have to look fundamentally at our values and what we're doing to each other, and recognize that incarceration is re-traumatizing for people who've already been traumatized. And what can we do to help them and prevent them from getting there to begin with? I think I'm huge on prevention. So, identifying kids who are at risk, who are coming from homes where there has been, difficulty, because we know those kids disproportionately end up in the criminal justice system. I think something like 90% of youth who are in detention have serious trauma histories, right? So that directly leads to criminal justice involvement. So the more we can do to bring people up and to help them, the more we're going to avoid this. But once they are in the justice system, to really work on helping them make those changes, because as you note, change is possible with the skills if done properly.
Okay, thank you very much. Where can people find you? Do you have a blog or a website they can go to?
I'm at the John Jay College of Criminal Justice. My last name is Jeglic. You can access me there. I've written articles and books. If they have any questions. So, it's something I'm passionate about, and we're teaching the next generation at John Jay, how to integrate research into practice, and hopefully, that will be the generation that kind of recognizes the importance of all of this, and helps to make a difference.
All right. Well, thank you very much for joining us. It's been a very fruitful discussion. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me. Take care.
You too. For now, this is the Rational Egoist signing out. I'm Michael Liebowitz. Till next time.